Hiyuki has been out for a day now, and I think I can finally say that Hiyuki is our first well-designed negative status character, thus breaking a curse that is over a year old. To provide a bit of context to those who do not know, in the past I have been incredibly negative about the negative status mechanic, primarily because it causes a ton of exclusivity, which makes a lot of the negative status characters hard to access at a baseline. DPSs very often have mechanics that require them to have certain supports because only certain characters can apply negative status. And when it comes to supports, it's a bit mixed. Phoebe is entirely saved because her absolution mode allows her to work without Zani, and Ciaccona's signature weapon coincidentally makes her a good support for Aero characters. And then when it comes to Chisa, she ended up being mediocre for so long that she needed to get 2 additional DPSs to really be considered a valuable character. So overall, negative status as a mechanic has hurt a lot of characters and their ability to build teams. However, Hiyuki is the first one where I can confidently say that negative status is not actively impacting their ability to make their teams. And in this video, I would like to explore why. Now first, I want to go past the other negative status characters and describe why I feel that they did not handle negative status as a mechanic correctly. Starting of course with the first one we got, which is Phoebe. Phoebe has 2 modes, Absolution and Confession. Absolution is a DPS mode that requires Spectral Frazzle to be on the enemy to get 256% damage amplification on her heavy attack Star Flash. And her Confession mode is a mode centered all around applying Spectral Frazzle and buffing Spectral Frazzle. Now first, I would like to completely write off Confession mode because there's literally only one scenario in which you would ever use this, which is with Zani, and I have pretty big issues with this. Not to mention the fact that the way Phoebe's Confession mode was designed is a very big reason as to why Zani turned out the way she did, but more on that during the Zani section. But even with Absolution, I feel that her Absolution mode was made in a pretty boring way. Simply giving damage amplification for Frazzle being on the enemy is in my opinion incredibly lame. If you're gonna make a character centered around negative status, you better have the negative status actually do something other than say herder more damage. Then for Aero Rover, Aero Rover was supposed to be the introduction to Aero Erosion. However, in my opinion, they failed pretty spectacularly, because Aero Rover is unable to actually apply any Aero Erosion without having another character to apply negative status. So ultimately, as an introduction to the negative status, it was a pretty bad deal. However, Rover did introduce the concept of raising the stack cap for a negative status, something that ended up becoming integral to negative status as a mechanic during La High Roy. So I am going to give Aero Rover props for that. Increasing the stack cap for a negative status makes the negative status do more damage, which leans into the idea of the negative status itself being a very big contributor when it comes to team damage, something that was very much lacking with Spectral Frazzle. Rover being unable to apply Aero Erosion on their own was pretty bad at the time of release, but now that we have Chisa who's able to apply Havoc Bane, it makes it a bit more acceptable. Aero Rover and Chisa ended up being Cartethyia's budget team, assuming you don't own Ciaccona. So while it was a pretty useless mechanic on release, it did eventually get a use case. Then for Zani, I really don't like how she integrated negative status into her kit. This is because instead of actually interacting with negative status herself, she uses negative status to fill her forte bar, which she uses to do heavy attacks that deal negative status damage, which in my opinion necessitates the need for Phoebe way more. Not only because Phoebe has both Res Shred and 100% damage amplification, but also because using Phoebe is the only way to actually max out Zani's Blaze Bar unless you do a lot of insane quick swap with Spectral Rover. And I feel that this second part about the Frazzle application is the real thing that doomed Zani without Phoebe. Yuno actually gives a very similar amount of damage amplification to Augusta, assuming maximum stacks of Blessing of the One Light. However, as we all know, Augusta was completely fine using Mortefi. So to me, the fault lies primarily with how Blaze works. When it comes to Ciaccona, she was pretty inoffensive, simply applying her negative status off-field. The fact that she has access to Frazzle too was in my opinion a very nice addition. and I think Ciaccona is the most well-designed negative status character within Renacida. Then we got Cartethyia. Cartethyia has a big problem in my opinion, in while she's not as bad as Zani when it comes to how her kit works, she still forces you into running certain characters in an incredibly boring way. First of all, her inherent skill that gives you more damage bonus based on how many stacks of air erosion there are on the enemy. This on its own is not bad, however the fact that it requires either Aero Rover or Chisa to fully max out is in my opinion not a good thing. Additionally, the damage amplification she gives to her liberation based on the amount of air erosion stacks on the enemy works the same way, where in order to actually get the maximum amount of stacks for this effect, you need to have either Aero Rover or Chisa in your team. The issues of her consuming air erosion stacks have primarily been solved because of the Aero Rover and Chisa team, which means you're no longer forced into running Ciaccona with her. So ultimately, I don't think Cartethyia has that many problems anymore. Then we got Chisa, who is simply a very inoffensive negative status character, essentially serving as a better Aero Rover for every negative status. I think the addition of Chisa was in fact a good thing. She finally gave negative status characters a sense of certainty, that even if you don't want to get a character's signature negative status healer, Chisa is always going to be a good alternative. Next up, we got Aemeath in version 3.1, who was her introduction to the Resonance Mode mechanic. Resonance Mode allowed Aemeath to be good in both Toon Rupture teams as well as Fusion Burst teams, but as many of you know by now, her Fusion Burst team pales in comparison, for one very simple reason. She does not have her signature support yet, currently being stuck in a Linnae-Chisa combination, which, fun fact, is actually better within the Toon Rupture mode than it is the Fusion Burst mode. All of this is because her Fusion Trail mechanic is incredibly integral to her kit. She can force Fusion Burst procs whenever she uses her Forte skill, with this being enhanced when she is in her ultimate mode, and additionally being enhanced based on the amount of Fusion Trail on the enemy. The problem is that Aemeath is only able to inflict a maximum of 9 stacks of Fusion Burst per rotation, which is not even half the amount you need to fully cap out Fusion Trail. Not only this, you also have no source of actually buffing Fusion Burst outside of Chisa's Ultra skill, which means that even when you do get a large amount of Fusion Trail stacks, you're still not gonna have that many sources of buffing on it, which means that the big thing that Aemeath's kit is meant to revolve around in Fusion Burst mode is completely underbaked without having Denia in your team. However, I just spent the last 7 minutes complaining about every negative status character except for Ciaccona and Chisa. So what does Hiyuki do that means she breaks the negative status curse? How does she strike that fine line between properly integrating negative status into her kit while not forcing you into the mechanic and leaving you homeless without negative status supports? In my opinion, it comes down to 2 factors. Number 1, the amount of negative status she applies on her own is very high, and number 2, the negative status mechanics within her kit are not forced upon you. When reading through Hiyuki's kit, you're most likely going to notice that most of the mechanics she has in her kit are the mechanics of a bog standard liberation damage hypercarry, having some aspects within her kit that enforce you to use negative status. So most of her kit is actually very simple, meaning that combinations like Linnae Mornia will be completely fine for the character, because there's nothing that forces her into having a certain amount of negative status, outside of one inherent skill, which I'm going to talk about shortly. Because Hiyuki does have some mechanics in her kit that encourage the use of negative status in a very smart way. First of all, instead of Glacio Chafe, Hiyuki has Glacio Bite. During the Zani section, I complained about Blaze and Heliacal Ember. However, I think Glacio Bite as a mechanic is completely justified. This is mainly because Glacio Chafe is the lowest damaging negative status in the entire game, so it's going to need some sort of boost to allow it to actually be strong on Hiyuki. And the way she handles this is by causing Glacio Chafe to deal an immediate proc of damage based on the maximum amount of stacks that Glacio Chafe can currently have, meaning that Chisa is able to increase the damage of these Glacio Bite procs. And because Hiyuki has a lot of negative status application within her own kit, she does not need some sort of support to actively take advantage of this mechanic. The reason Chisa is Hiyuki's current best in slot is that because even before the release of Lucilla, Hiyuki is able to apply 20 stacks of Glacio Chafe on her own, which is quite a lot of stacks. In fact, that is more than the amount of Spectrofrazzle stacks that Phoebe is able to apply, which means that even without Lucilla, Hiyuki is able to take proper advantage of Glacio Bite as a mechanic. However, I think it's incredibly important to say that she's not forced into using the mechanic. Glacio Bite is strong if you build for it, but if you don't build for Glacio Bite, you don't have to despair, because a lot of what helps Glacio Bite is Hiyuki's inherent skill. This will give Hiyuki a stack of Snow Rust, depending on if teammates apply Glacio Chafe or Havoc Bane. This means that her negative status damage only gets enhanced if you actually focus on the negative status itself. So if you're running a Lene Mornia team, while you are losing out on 2 stacks of Snow Rust, the only things you're actually losing is buffs to the negative status itself. And because this team is a lot more focused on Hiyuki's personal crit damage, you end up not losing as much as you would think by losing out on those 2 stacks of Snow Rust. So somehow, they managed to strike a fine balance between creating a character whose optimal playstyle involves focusing on the negative status, while not outright forcing the character into engaging with the mechanic. Obviously, in a perfect world, negative status wouldn't be this exclusive in the first place, and you would be able to make every negative status character fully hone in on the negative status. But because it's so exclusive, I think that Kuro Games has to find these middle grounds, that while a character should be optimal within their intended use case, the character can still be functional outside of that intended use case. But that's just my opinion on Hiyuki. Let me know what you think of her down in the comments below, and while you're down there, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Additionally, if you have any questions, be sure to join my Discord server, which is linked down in the description below. But that'll be all from me. Peace.